In the morning to hear a talk on IRBs, you have no life, obviously. So I'm going to talk for about half an hour about what IRBs do and why. And there's a theme to this. It's that what IRBs do is completely traceable to federal regulations. And the federal regulations are amazingly brief, and it is in your best interest to read them once in your life so that you actually know what you're talking about. The ratio of people's opinions about what IRBs do and should do to the actual knowledge about what the regulations say in an average academic medical center is about 10 to 1. And you want to be the one who actually understand. These are our cats. You can see that they are reading the New England Journal. This was actually just a random picture I had. Each one of these cats weighs 5 times as big as Chris Coffey's dog. Financial disclosure, is a member of Berry Consultants, support from the NIH, and I do some work with a company that works in biologics. So the historical perspective, there have been a number of historical events that have led to qualitative changes in the way we look at human subjects protection. And there's quite a few of them, but just a few to sort of jog your memory. So during World War II, there were multiple abuses of humans and human subjects by a variety of countries, not just Germany. But in the aftermath of World War II, this led to some efforts to try to codify or clarify basic principles that should be followed in the protections of humans who are in vulnerable positions, and that includes research subjects. The Nuremberg Code is one of the most important documents in terms of clarifying the role of consent prior to experimentation. The Declaration of Helsinki establishes the principles of independent review of proposed research subjects and the need for sufficient scientific basis prior to the initiation of a research study that involves humans. Many of you are familiar with the Tuskegee syphilis study. This is a study that was an observational study of syphilis in African Americans in the U.S. And the key issue there is that they continued to withhold therapy and not inform the research subjects that there was an effective therapy for the disease long after it came into routine clinical practice. So the key principle there was that we had a responsibility to update the information that we provide to human subjects during a research study. The lessons that were learned regarding the protection of human subjects were clarified in the Belmont report, and that establishes 3 basic ethical principles, which are respect for persons that are going to be research subjects, trying to maximize beneficence, meaning the benefit versus non-malfeasance, which is just avoiding harm, and justice, which means that the populations that have the potential or will ultimately benefit from the results of the research are the populations that bear the burden and the risk of being research subjects. This is a very, very important principle. Essentially, you're not allowed to experiment to the people over here in order to derive a therapy that will only be used on the people over there, and often the here and the there is economic or socioeconomic status. The basic principle here is that you want to hurt as few people as possible as medical knowledge is forwarded. This is a cartoon borrowed without permission from the New Yorker, and it shows that the person buried was a member of the placebo group. Just want to point out that as a general rule, being in the placebo group is a great option because you get all of the extra attention and care and interest of your physician without bearing any of the risks. And yet, in popular beliefs, people think being in the placebo group is bad because there's this tendency to believe that experimental therapies are very likely to be effective, and in many diseases areas that's in fact not true. And this is an example of the therapeutic misconception that the purpose of research is to benefit the individual, when in fact, in general, it's primarily aiming at forwarding medical knowledge. All of these principles were captured in a set of federal regulations that are generically called the Common Rule. The Common Rule is called common because a single set of reasonably harmonized regulations apply across a multitude, actually 16 federal agencies. So it's not just Health and Human Services and the NIH, but also the FDA, the Department of Defense, and a whole bunch of others. And the common rule that applies to Health and Human Services, and therefore the NIH, is codified in 45 CFR 46. It's actually quite short, and you should read it once, but at the end I'll tell you which version you should read. We'll come back to that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through just very brief sections of these regs and tie them to what an IRB does, because understanding this connection allows you to have effective conversations with your IRB administrator and understand their motivations for the things that they require. So the first point, 46.1, talks about what does this apply to. Actually, these regulations only apply to federally funded or federally affiliated research. But almost all of the institutions that you will ever be affiliated with have voluntarily entered into what's called a federal assurance, which is saying that because we receive some federal money, we assure the government, we agree, we are obligated to apply the federal regulations to all of the research we do, whether it is associated with federal funding or not. So when you do an unfunded project and your organization applies the federal rules, that's an organizational decision. It's actually not what the law requires. But once you've entered into an assurance, you have to follow them. The definition of research is actually a slightly controversial thing and actually a little bit flux. But as a general rule, any activity that's designed to create generalizable knowledge, something that someone else will use in the treatment of somebody else or in the scientific endeavor, you should think of as research. This usually becomes a talking point or a discussion when there's QI activities, but as a general rule, I would say that if you expect anybody else other than you to learn from your QI activity outside of your organization, then it is research. The human subject is a living individual. This actually excludes research on deceased donors, even if they have a beating heart. And that's actually an interesting area of controversy. And then the next section is the section that actually says there has to be an institutional review board that evaluates the merits of the research against the requirements of the federal regulations to decide whether the research can proceed. It talks about the membership of the IRB. It has to have at least 5 members with varying backgrounds to promote complete and adequate review of research activities. And that includes a lay member who does not have any financial or scientific conflict of interest with respect to the research institution or the research being conducted. So your institution will probably be periodically trying to find IRB members from the community or get people to serve on an IRB. How many of you served on an IRB? Okay. So actually, I'm going to do a real quick survey. Raise your hand high if you served on an IRB. Okay. Keep your hand up if you think it was an educational experience. I didn't say enjoyable, educational. Okay, so everybody. I actually encourage my junior faculty members to do this because you learn a huge amount about how research is written up. You read protocols of varying quality. You get to recognize what's a good protocol and a bad protocol. And you learn what everybody else in your institution is doing, which is very, very helpful for becoming members of research teams and doing collaborative science. And it is such a valuable service to the institution that your IRB administrator is in debt to you. And the fact that I was on an IRB for 5 years has yielded much greater benefits than the effort I contributed over another 25 years at the institution. The IRB is required by the regs to review the original research, to review the consent form itself if there's a written consent document, and the procedures through which the consent will be documented. And then to perform a continuing review, which means ongoing evaluation of the research. So if you think of the Tuskegee study as being an example of the importance of ongoing review and reevaluating the ethical merits and the consent procedures and the information provided to research subjects as new information becomes available, continuing review is intended to make sure that we do those periodic reevaluations. In addition, there is a set of expedited review procedures. The term expedited means that the IRB is still going to review the research, but they are allowed to take shortcuts. The shortcuts are allowing a vice chair of the IRB to make a preliminary decision on the acceptability of the research and allow it to move forward, subject to a later verification by some procedure within the full committee. There are a set of types of low-risk research, think of survey procedures with identifiable information, those sorts of things, that can be conducted with an expedited, under an expedited category. It is, if you're doing something that's kind of doesn't seem like a very high-risk thing, it's worth, during the design stage of your study, looking at the expedited categories, and if you can make a little tweak and make it fit, that may be a good strategy to get your study out quite a bit sooner in some institutions than if you have one piece that makes it not qualify for expedited and therefore requires a full review. One of the key categories of research that can be evaluated by an expedited process is so-called minimal risk research. The term minimal risk has a very, very specific definition within the regulations. It is research that does not entail risk to the subject beyond the risks that they incur in their everyday activities or in the conduct of routine physical or psychological examinations or tests. And there's some debate over whether physical includes blood drawing. So minimal risk doesn't mean you think it's minimal. So a neurosurgeon's idea of minimal risk for someone with a subdural and 3 centimeters of shift is different than what that means minimal risk here. And in addition, minor changes in previously approved studies can be approved by an expedited mechanism. The term expedited is a different term than exempt. The exempt categories of research, which is even a lower risk category, means that the research, that these regulations don't actually apply. But almost all institutions that you will be affiliated with have a process by which, even if the research should be exempt, you're not allowed to decide that yourself. Your IRB decides it for you, because it turns out physicians, researchers, are not the best judge of whether their own research should be considered exempt. So what does the IRB actually talk about when they meet? That's not an IRB, they look too happy. The IRB has to consider by law specific criteria that are in the regs before they can approve a study. And these criteria are linked to the principles in the Belmont report. So the first is that the risks are minimized, and that's part of the principle of beneficence. The risks are reasonable relative to the expected benefits and knowledge to be gained. And the benefits there are the benefits either to the individuals participating or to the population of patients who have the same condition. The selection of subjects is equitable. That's the process of justice. And I'm just going to digress for a second. One of the areas in which I think justice has become the most, at least interesting to discuss, is the development of therapies that are likely to be very, very expensive. So when we have investigations of therapies for drugs, say of rare diseases, where it may be the drug is going to cost $100,000 a year to give, and it may or may not be covered by various reimbursement mechanisms. It's an interesting question whether the research to develop that drug can include subjects who will probably never have access to it, because that would violate the principle of justice. The informed consent documents and procedures must be evaluated by the IRB as part of respect for persons. That the informed consent can be given by the subject, by a legally authorized representative, which in some states and some institutions can be a member of the family, and in some it cannot. So it's very important to understand that our usual procedures for getting consent for routine clinical practice are very different than our procedures for deciding who's qualified to give consent for research. The reason for this is that when you as a treating physician approach a family member for permission to give an intervention that you believe to be therapeutic, the assumption is that your only interest is the benefit of that patient, and therefore you're not inherently conflicted. The regulations acknowledge that when you are a physician investigator, you have two interests. One, hopefully, is the interest of the research subject/patient. But the other is that you have a vested interest in the success of your research endeavor. And the more patients you get in, the better in general. And therefore, you are conflicted. And therefore, there's a tightening of requirements regarding who is allowed to give consent for research. And then there's an emergency exception, probably best seen in the FDA regulations, which is 21 CFR 50.24, which allows an exception for the requirement for informed consent for a very narrow set of research studies for the treatment of devastating and unpredictable conditions for which there is no effective therapy. The IRB also has to review documentation of informed consent. That's part of respect for persons. It is really important that you think of the consent form as not consent itself, but as a documentation of a process. So when your IRB asks you in some little box, please describe how consent can be obtained, they're thinking of consent as a process through which the patient is informed about the risks, benefits, and alternatives to participation in the research, their rights as a research subject, their ability to withdraw, the availability of payment for compensatory care if they are injured by the research, et cetera, et cetera. The form is supposed to document that they have been given an appropriate opportunity to understand all those things, consider them within their own value system prior to agreeing to participate in your research study. The form is never a form of an experience that I had with documentation of informed consent was during my wife's pregnancy. They were doing a study for which she was potentially a research candidate, and they handed her during a visit a stack of about a half-inch of forms, most of which were routine consent for care, and buried 2/3 of the way down, there was consent for a research study. It was a colorful conversation. And the ultrasound tech was instead just to hand these to you, sort of sign the way you sign loan documents for a house where you read nothing and you just sign your life away. They're just handing them to you. That is not consent. That's, I think, fraud. Okay. The IRB needs to evaluate your plan for monitoring the study data. So part of beneficence is you want to make sure that as the study progresses, there isn't evidence that there is starting to be a harm to the subjects above and beyond that which was anticipated for the study. That requires an ongoing plan for monitoring the incoming data, the adverse event requirements, etc. They're supposed to look at your plans for maintaining the privacy and confidentiality of data, and then if you are including in your study vulnerable populations for which they have a particular difficulty in maintaining their own rights and welfare. So that could be developmental disabilities, head injury, prisoners, children, etc. Then there's additional scrutiny paid to the protection of those subjects. So each one of these things that the IRB asks you about, they're not asking you about out of curiosity. They're asking you about it because there is a place in 46111 that says they have to document that they have evaluated this aspect of your research. 45 CFR 46 also includes a section which lays out the general requirements for informed consent and the elements in the informed consent document. And one of the things that is really interesting to me is that the informed consent document went from being something that was too long and difficult because the regulations have a whole bunch of components in it and probably not very effective, to something that was reviewed by legal counsel at institutions and became from ineffective to just laughable in terms of an effective way of ensuring that people understood what they were getting into and considerations. And now there's a lot of effort to try to simplify both consent documents and consent procedures. I guess a work in progress. Children represent a very particular vulnerable population, and the regulations, when they were written, were intended to provide additional protections for children. So the IRB must evaluate if you intend to include children in your study. The study qualifies under an additional category that allows such research. These basically represent a series of graded categories with respect to the risk of the research, where the higher risk categories require the prospect of direct benefit to the individual child or to the class of children who have the disease in question. So if there's minimal risk, you can do research on children because those are the risks that they encounter in their everyday life or going to the pediatrician. But if it involves greater than minimal risk in 46.405, it must present the prospect of direct benefit to the individual's child, or in 46, generalizable knowledge about the subject's disorder or condition, and it's a graded scale. You have to be able to put your research plan that involves children into one of these categories for the IRB to legally be able to approve it. Now, there has been a lot of movement with respect to the distribution of the types of IRBs in which studies are evaluated. When the concept of the IRB was first developed, there was a belief that, or maybe an acknowledgement, that the sensibilities of communities vary quite a bit from location to location within the United States. And what is considered acceptable or appropriate for a consent procedure or risk or, say, a balance of burden across ethnic groups really varies by location. So the IRB was an institutional review board that was a local entity, and the laypersons were to be drawn from the community in which the research was to be conducted with the intent that they had an understanding of the sensibilities of the local community. That turns out, as we move towards more and more large multi-center clinical trials, to be an inefficient evaluation mechanism. And so there's been a lot of effort in large multi-center trials to have a single central IRB, or a commercial IRB often, that does the primary review. Now this is more efficient, and the NIH actually has a policy on single primary IRB review to try to avoid the problem that many RCTs have had, which is that you spend the first 2 years of your funding trying to get all your sites approved, and then you have a much shorter period of time during which you can evaluate research subjects. So this is a website. This is actually a year ago website because their website didn't work properly last night. For WIRB, which is the Western IRB, it's in Washington. It's just a single well-known one. I have no financial interest or association with them. But it's worth flipping through this and understanding the services that they provide. The goal is to leverage the repeated experience, because if they've read that exact protocol for site 1, when they're looking at it for site 2, 3, or 4, they only have to consider the differences specific to that site, and so it's a more efficient review process. It also ensures greater consistency. There's an NIH policy on the use of a single central institutional review board of record for RCTs, and just be clear that a single IRB doesn't mean centralized. It could be an IRB, for example, at a lead institution. The potential concern with centralized IRBs has to do with this requirement for ongoing review of studies, because they may not understand the local environment, and it may be difficult for them to understand, for example, patterns of AEs or dropouts at a particular particular to each institution. And again, I think that that's a sort of a work in progress, trying to figure out how best to make sure that a centralized IRB understands the differences between sites. They do vary tremendously in quality and cost. Most of your institutions will have identified a subset of commercial IRBs that they trust and are willing to cede the review responsibility to. And obviously you're bound to stick with those. These are our dogs. They're looking into the future. They're actually looking over the lights of Los Angeles. The Labradoodle on the left really does sit there at night and look out at the lights. They're both scared of the cats. Okay. Good. Okay. This is an odd talk to give because the rules are in flux. So what I just described for you were the rules that are currently in effect that were based on the common rule published in 1991. There were definitely some issues with the common rule. There's probably an overly broad definition of research. Some of the requirements like IRB review prior to submitting a grant were burdensome because if your grant doesn't get funded, the IRB review hasn't really done anything. And so there has been a massive effort to revise the common rule. And you should just think for a second what this means. This is revising a large set of federal regulations that apply to 16 different federal agencies. You know, we have a great gratitude of debt to whoever has sacrificed their life and quality of life in order to do this. But the revised common rule was first published in 2017. It's been revised in 2018. But there's been periods of public comment, as appropriately with intent for rulemaking, that has resulted in a number of delays. We are currently in a delay period, which extends from July 19th of this year through January of 2019. So the revised common rule is not in effect. There are three elements, however, of the common rule, the revised common rule, that you're allowed to use early because they were intended specifically to reduce the burdensome nature of human subjects review. Those three provisions are a revised definition of research. The biggest piece of that is there's certain types of publications that are focused on single individuals that are not intended to create generalizable knowledge, kind of case report-like things that are now not defined as research, so they're excluded from review. There are certain categories of low-risk research where you don't even have to do annual continuing reviews, and an elimination of the requirement that an IRB review your research prior to the application going in for funding. So your institution may elect voluntarily to act on these three reductions in burden, or they may elect to continue to go by the old rules. And then in January of 2019, the new regulations go into effect. I flipped through the new regulations last night to see if anything I was telling you changed. Nothing has really changed at the level of detail that I provided. So in conclusion, successful interaction with your IRB really depends on you understanding what the IRB does and why they do it, and that it is not them just being picky to try to mess with you. The regulatory requirements define what they do, and if you understand the regulations, I mean, I know they're not fun to read, but it's really not that long. And it allows, if you understand them, you can use the terminology that they use, and you can show an understanding and a respect for what they have to do and why. And that actually is much more likely to result in your projects being approved sooner and in an appropriate format that's both scientifically valid and has appropriate human subjects protection. I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Be happy to take any questions if we'll allow.
Hi, thank you for your talk. We are going to be part of a clinical trial that is being funded by industry and foundation money, and we were told that you can use Word for certain funding agencies such as foundation. Can you comment on that?
So just to clarify, so you were told that you're not allowed to use a word, Western IRB, if it is funded by a foundation. Okay. So the commercial IRBs have fees associated with them. And sometimes institutions have rules because of the way they do indirect cost recovery, whether they want to pay those fees. But I am not aware of any regulatory reason why there would be such a limitation. Okay, now, maybe someone else knows, but okay, you don't?
Well, your institution may have regulations. So the University of California for years has had a contractual agreement with WORD, but it was limited to phase 3 industry-sponsored trials. So you couldn't use WORD just for any study you wanted to. It had to fit specific categories that the institution outlined.
Yeah, so my institution has a similar thing. It was to make sure that our IRB volume didn't fall below a level that justified their existence, but this has nothing to do with law.
Is it a
multi-center trial? I mean, it's also a little bit of a different thing now with the new requirements for there to be a single IRB for multi-site studies. So I can sort of see why your institution wouldn't want them to be doing a single-site investigator-initiated foundation trial, but it does, I would agree, it seems a little...
Yeah, there's something about your institution. So our institution actually allows work even for single-site local studies, as long as the investigators are willing to pay the fee. Okay. Any other questions?
So you have your trial, you're doing your trial, and something comes out that is evidence that your placebo group should no longer be a placebo group. Whose responsibility is it to make that determination? Because there's typically not perfect overlap with studies, and so you may be answering different questions, but and is it after one trial is positive, or who is the one that says there's enough evidence that you can no longer have a placebo?
So that's a great question. So if, as a physician, you're deciding when is there enough evidence to change your practice, I will no longer give my old control treatment to a patient like this in routine clinical practice. I'm going to move it. You have your own threshold that the evidence would need to surpass for you to change your clinical practice. That is not the threshold for this. As part of respect for persons, you need to inform the patients when there's been a change in the information that they use to judge whether they were willing to accept randomization, if it rises to the level where a reasonable person would want to know. It's a much lower threshold. So if there is a new study coming out that says, wow, it might be better to treat your patients with A rather than B, where B was your control treatment, you are obligated to let the IRB know and let the IRB evaluate that information and decide what changes in the consent process and what reconsenting process needs to be undergone in order to make sure the patients are informed. So another way of thinking about it is, given the knowledge the way it is, say today, would you have written your consent form and your section about the alternative therapies differently? And if you would have written it differently, you need to make it different now. So it's a very low threshold.
Is the IRB
It's the investigator who is responsible for bringing that to the attention of the IRB. The IRB is not, scouring the literature. It is completely on the investigator. And this is an area in which I think the conflict of interest between the investigator and the welfare of the subjects is particularly acute. Because the investigator may think, oh my God, if I change my control treatment, my whole study becomes much less interpretable and publishable. And so they have a vested interest to pretend that new information isn't out. You really have to avoid that. And this is, picture, for example, ongoing clinical trials for treatment for acute ischemic stroke. I think it's fair to say that the landscape with respect to indications for thrombectomy therapy is really rapidly changing. And a control treatment, say a medical support only therapy group that was completely fine 3 years ago is really not fine today. And so clinical trials get, become unethical to continue when new information comes out that shows that the control group is no longer receiving an acceptable standard of care.
Quick, oh no, one other question. How do central IRBs and DSMBs interact?
They really don't very much. So the continuing review process that the IRB has to undergo is actually part of data safety and monitoring. But the plan that you submit to the DSMB should include, to the centralized IRB, should in most RCTs include the plan for an independent data safety monitoring committee or data monitoring committee to oversee this study. And then the IRB only needs assurance that that DSMB monitoring process is actually in effect and proceeding as planned. I don't think the interactions have actually been that close. The continuing review of the IRB should require documentation that the DSMB has met, evaluated the risks and benefits, and has recommended continuation of the study.
All right.
In the context of your story about your wife and the OB, can you comment a little bit on how individuals who aren't part of the study would go about reporting their concerns about somebody else's study to an IRB?
So most institutions have some sort of complaint hotline. So I just call it their risk management, which gives you a lot of attention, especially when you call from within the hospital. But I think that the concern that I have is there's a lot of research being done where people don't know that this form is different than every other form they're signing, and so I think the issue is people knowing that they have been treated inappropriately. But if you know that, I think you can report it to the IRB if you're sophisticated enough to know that, or to the institution's risk management. If you call the risk management department of a hospital and you tell them that you believe that a research subject or a research project is not being performed properly, I have a very high level of confidence that the investigator will hear about it.
I'm talking more about the opposite, and what are the implications, for example, for a junior faculty member having concerns about a study that a senior faculty member is doing, and what are downstream possible consequences of that type of report?
You mean to the reporter, sort of a
Yes.
whistleblower question?
Yes.
Well, all of this is a little bit as far astray, but all of your institutions have protections for whistleblowers under federal law, okay? And those protections are actually very, very strong. But the only thing that I would recommend is that if one is in a position where you're questioning the ethical conduct of research from someone else in your institution, you find a uninvolved party who has an academic or administrative rank above both of you to discuss your concerns first and ask for guidance. Okay? But in fact, as a whistleblower, especially if there's a patient protection issue, your protections are quite strong. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis.